Welcome back to another podcast episode where we help aspiring developers get jobs and junior developers grow. Today, we are going to be talking about how you should represent yourself as a software engineer, trying to get your first position. And we'll probably be diving a lot into resumes and similar topics. But I'm having my old boss, Scott, back on. Scott, how you doing?
I'm doing. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good, actually. Pretty good. Honestly, the reason why I brought you on is you were a good boss. And I'm not just saying that, but you were also honest. You gave a lot of good, candid feedback, which I think a lot of people need to hear. And so I thought you'd be the perfect person to talk about this topic. So we're going to dive into how to represent yourself on your resume and maybe expand a little past that. So let's go ahead and get started. You want to give us a feel for kind of your experience hiring software engineers, leading teams?
Sure. In terms of just hiring, I've been exposed pretty much from the get-go of my career. I've been doing this for 12 years now, 13 years now. And I've been working as a manager for probably 8 to 9 of those years, and then full-time as a manager, not as an IC, for the last 6. I could not tell you how many people I have interviewed over the years, engineers hired, etc. I have a team now of about 80 individuals. And so I think in Adelaide, we were about a dozen, maybe, right? Teams of all sizes. I had a team of about 50 before that. So I've done a lot with growth of teams and going through both the hiring processes as well as the career development pieces.
Okay. Have you taken a look at a lot of resumes yourself?
Yep. I review every single one for any candidate that's made. It depends on the hiring process, and I'll use our current process of Numerator as an example. We have recruiters that are internal. They're going to be doing the initial top of the funnel filtering. Every once in a while, I might get one passed over to me to look at before we move them through to a technical screen. But as soon as that person gets to a technical screen of some caliber, it could be an early one, it could be a later one, I'm going to see that person's resume through that process.
Okay. All right. Very cool. So I think I kind of just want to dive into it. There are kind of a lot of pieces of advice going on, and there's a lot of controversial pieces of advice with resumes specifically. So I kind of just overall, once we're done with this conversation, I want to give people a feel for how they should best represent themselves. There's kind of this idea of, sometimes you have to stretch the truth, maybe to push past automated systems, but ultimately, how far is too far with stretching some of that truth. So let's go ahead and start with the first topic. So for example, sometimes people have pretty large gaps in their work history. So, sometimes you get advice with, don't put it on your resume. Don't put the position on your resume. Don't show your work history. Don't be specific about the dates. Lie about the dates. It's not that relevant. Should you stretch the truth on this? And kind of where do you draw the line?
So I draw the line on a hard no on lying. Just don't do that, because if it's on the resume, you could get asked the question and you're going to get caught with your pants down and have to answer something that you're going to be dishonest about. And that's going to show up pretty quickly. Work history is an interesting caveat, though, because, maybe you had an unfortunately short time at your last job, right? And so do you really want to be able to speak to that? It depends on the circumstances there. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. So in that kind of a case, if you're going to leave it off, nobody's going to know any differently. I would probably do the same thing if I was ever in that position. But otherwise, I think generally be as honest as possible, unless there are truly extenuating circumstances where the truth just isn't going to help you or could muddy the situation.
Okay. So I'm thinking of a situation, maybe you signed on as a software engineer, you just realized it wasn't a good fit. You were there for maybe a month or two. Maybe that's not relevant. Maybe you had a bad falling out with that company and you just quit. There could be several reasons. But what about this situation where, maybe someone just has a 2-year gap. They really struggle to find a job. Should they list their work history and show that gap?
That doesn't raise a red flag to me. And in fact, it's the opposite that not quite the opposite. But what raises a red flag to me is somebody that has a lot of work history. And that's actually one of the first things that I look at is I'll go back and look at their history. And are you spending 6 to 9 months at places, or are you somebody that actually likes to dig in and stick around? So yeah, if there's been a 2-year gap in your work history, but you spent 1.5 years, 2 years at the place you were at before, it shows me that you're committed. The fact that you had a hard bout of it trying to get your next gig that's just unfortunate. But that's where, why are we having the conversation right at that point? Is because we're trying to solve that for you. But I definitely wouldn't hide that.
Okay. So that's interesting. So you kind of mentioned the idea of 6 to 9 months. Some people get a developer job that maybe isn't with the stack they want to learn. Maybe they get stuck just, this is a common thing, working with WordPress when they want to do more heavy programming. Maybe they, dive into the front end, they realize they really want to dive into the back end. But ultimately, they're in this position that's not really helping them grow in the direction they want to grow in. How long do you feel like they should probably stick it out? Is there a benefit to waiting a certain amount of time? Or
I think it depends on the state you're in your career. And if you're very early on, entry level, the thing I tell every engineer that is young that works for me is there is no bad experience. If you don't like it, if you hate it, and WordPress is a good candidate for that, that's one thing, right? But if it's, let's say that you're pretty comfortable on the front end, maybe you've been really enjoying Vue in your spare time and now you're doing React, you're not as crazy about it, I would never quit that job personally. I would get as much experience out of that as I possibly can. The most important thing you can do early in your career is just write. Eventually, you're going to find your niche where you feel really comfortable. You're going to start getting really, you're hitting a stride with the technologies that you really enjoy. And you just have to get all that kind of out of your system early on. So unless it is truly something, and there's not a whole lot in this industry where you can get trapped like that, but if it's almost something that is truly not going to benefit you in the long term, I would recommend sticking with it.
Okay, that's good.
WordPress
advice.
And SharePoint come as the two pieces where it goes.
And SharePoint. Okay, so look out for
SharePoint,
that.
ostensibly worse than WordPress, but yeah, feel free to run for the hills with those two.
Okay, good advice. So I think another thing a lot of people struggle with is, best representing their personal projects, right? How do you get experience as a software engineer before you get your first position? We kind of dove into internships a little bit like before the podcast. Maybe we can touch on it. But more importantly, most people, they're trying to build personal projects. They're trying to learn their stacks. And, a big question is like, what should I build? What do employers care about? But can you... So those are basically two ideas I want to talk about. For the first one, for your personal projects, how do you represent those on your resume? Do you put them as professional experience? Do you just put them under projects? How do you typically see them in an accurate way?
Usually when I see them on a resume, I'm thinking back to my own personal resume back when it was project-based. I just kind of listed them off, and I think I may have interspersed it with my work history. But these days I'll typically see work history split with projects, but they're, they're represented very similarly, where it's just kind of like the title of the project and the description. I guess this kind of goes back to your honesty question, but I will more often than not realize I'm not reading their work history anymore. I'm reading a project that they did, but it still comes off the same way. I'm still checking the same boxes that I would be looking for. And I think it works. It's effective. The projects are what you have to have, whether it's professional experience versus hobby experience, doesn't really matter, as long as it's just there and it's clear. With a lot of these, I'm kind of diving into your next question here. But with a lot of the challenges that you're looking at in a resume is at the first level, at top of the funnel, right? You mentioned the automated systems. It might be an automated system. It might be a team of actual humans that are reviewing this. All they're doing is pattern matching on certain buzzwords. So what is the right stack? What are the right projects, et cetera, et cetera? Like I said before, I don't think there is a wrong project unless it's WordPress or SharePoint. And as long as you're bubbling up, the certain aspects of that project that might be appealing to the right recruiter, you're going to be okay. It's just that next step then is the ability to talk through it, what you did with it, what are some of the challenges, what are the things that you learned, how did you get into that project in the first place, right? That whole journey of building those side projects is what I'm going to want to talk to somebody about when I get further into the interview process.
Okay. Do you think there is a difference between, and should there be a distinction between representing yourself working as a software engineer at a company versus like listing the project name like it's a company and like listing yourself as a software engineer?
Almost like the project was a company.
Yeah.
I would say if you're gonna do that, make it a real company. I've seen that enough over the years to say that it does make a difference, right? Because it's a different conversation that you're going to have afterwards. Like if this was something that you genuinely tried to sell, you were trying to monetize it, even if you're just sitting in your basement trying to bang on an app idea that you had, and you're trying to monetize it on the App Store, that's valid, but represent it correctly, right? I can think back to my own side projects, and I guarantee you most of them were not anything that was going to be business savvy or anything I could ever sell. And it'd be really hard to speak to those in that way. But the world's changed a lot, right, since back then. And so it now is much more of an ecosystem where people are creating their own businesses, small or large. Those businesses may be complete failures. Those are good conversations to have. I personally like failure. So yeah, long-winded answer.
That's interesting. No, that was a good answer. I agree with a lot of that. So you're basically saying if you're going to represent it like that, try to start a company, try to get a user base behind it, get people using it or something, get value, or maybe would you say like if you're going to list it like that, you need to at least try to make money off of it, gain a user base? Like what's the distinction?
I'm saying it should be an honest representation. So if you are an entrepreneurial spirit and that's what you do and you started a company and that's how it was, no matter how successful it may have or may not have been, then it's okay to represent it as a company because that's technically what it was. But if this was just use mobile app as the example here, if it was just some hobby app that you built and you threw it on the store and maybe you like served up ads in it or something, but it really wasn't anything you're really intending to try to drive forward with, that's not going to lead to an honest conversation, right? It really just goes back to that whole honesty piece of don't get caught being asked questions about your business that wasn't really a business, but I represented it as such so that you thought I had work experience. Have the conversation with, here's a company that I actually tried to run for 6 to 9 months. Here's the things that went wrong with it. Here's how I built this, the application. Here's why I picked this stack versus that stack. Be able to have that discussion. If it isn't that, have the same conversation, but it's more of not that I ran this company for 6 to 9 months and it failed, but I was kind of interested in this thing and I wanted to learn this. And so this is why I built this. And that was my project. And here's the things that I learned from that. And yes, this may or may not have been applicable to, the rest of whatever we would be talking about for that job interview. But just represent them correctly for what they are. Because it does stick out very quickly, very loudly in the interview process and I see this a lot. I see it a lot more these days where I think of my own evolution and I had a resume for years that was project-based and it was listing projects that I did for jobs and then projects that I did personally. And then as my role shifted over the years, my resume became much more business metrics focused and just talking about business performance and different impacts that I've had on that particular company. And I've found that I will gravitate towards that when people put that into the resume, because for me, it's interesting now. I'm not an IC anymore. I tend to focus much more on the business side of things. And it's not all that uncommon that I will see somebody with something on their resume saying like, oh, such and such growth, X% growth in revenue, and blah, 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 blah. And I'll ask a little bit more about that. They have no answer, like none whatsoever. Like that bullet in their resume was like, sure, it may have been an impact of that, but they had no real role in that. That wasn't really what they're focusing on, but they're, kind of steering away from it. And that sticks out. It sticks out very loudly.
Okay. I have a question to follow that in just a minute. So that's really interesting. So accurately represent it. If you are trying to start a company, that's a great thing to highlight. And it sounds like someone like you would probably be very intrigued by that. Mm-hmm. So what, I guess, maybe this is kind of a broad question. Maybe there are a lot of answers to this. So to put you on the spot, what would be a few projects that have really stood out to you that aspiring developers, like brand new developers, created? What did they create that like really caught your attention and had you interested?
It's usually the ones, and I'm biased here, for the record, but it's usually the ones that have nothing to do with the job that we're talking about. That tells me that you are a very adventurous, creative person. We were chatting before about CS degrees versus boot camps, and I'll be the guy who points this out, that you come out of school with a CS degree, you still don't have the skills to know how to do a job, right? Like, you're still learning, right? Even at that point. But it's just, you go out there, you write as much as you can early on in your career, and you're just learning. And it's definitely valuable to learn things like the stacks that you want to be working with. I did a lot of that early on in my career. I really got attached to Python when I was working in a PHP shop, and I started doing a whole lot of side projects in Python, and then that evolved into, now I can't get away from Python. But I also had side projects that went completely unrelated. Right? I once wrote a pet language, and that has served me no benefits whatsoever in my career.
Oh, wait,
but I just wanted.
What language?
I wrote my own language.
Oh, you wrote your own language. Oh, okay,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah. It served me no purpose whatsoever professionally. Like,
yeah.
But it evolved into this whole path where, I remember, this is like 10 years ago. I read an article in Hacker News that was talking about like Lua had been ported to the Erlang VM. And I was like, that's interesting, but I don't really understand that. And then later that night, I'm there researching more about VMs than I had done before, because when I was in college, I had one professor tell me, VMs are kind of hard to write. It'll take about a month to write the first one. And then after that, you can write them in about a week. And that's all I ever learned about virtual machines. So kind of went that path. I'm like, all right, well, let me try to write a language for the JVM, right? I start with that, build that. And then it's like coincidence and timing. Like a few months later, the creator of Minecraft was creating a new game, and part of the game mechanic was you write programs on your spaceship. And so he had spec'd out a whole virtual machine. There's a small community of people out there, yours truly included, who wrote up virtual machines for this thing, and now I'm starting to get good at it, right? Then a couple months later, I'm having a conversation with some colleagues, and there's an Ars Technica article about Super Nintendo emulators and how hard they are to get accurate. And a buddy of mine goes, yeah, but the Nintendo is much harder. I go, I could do that.
Of course.
4 months later, I've got it. Like, none of this stuff had any benefit to me as like who I am today as an engineer. But these were just fun things to do. And that's my bias, right? Like, is that I spent a lot of that time early in my career just sort of chasing whatever was cool and interesting, and just kind of trying to stretch myself. But when I look at any candidate today, or even internal candidates, like I'll meet engineers that are on my team that I might not have had a lot of time with, and I'll do skip levels and learn more about them, and find that they spend a lot of time just sort of exploring these different areas. And those are the ones that I usually find they're very creative, they're good problem solvers. They're highly motivated. And it tends to lead to a very good discussion, right? As long as you have the foundations of software engineering, you can really do anything. And so when you're branching off into those more creative directions, whatever they may be, that is a very good sign that you have those strong foundations.
Wow. That's a lot to take in. That's impressive, because a lot of aspiring developers, they don't know what to build, right? They're trying to figure that out for the life of them. And I think they're scared to explore building something because it could take a month, could take 2 months. And all of a sudden, like you said, is it important? Like, is it going to actually, first of all, is it important? Like, is it going to help them in their career? But secondly, are employers going to care about it? And what you're saying is sometimes that exploration is admirable. Sometimes that exploration tells you like they love learning new things and building things, but they maybe it's because they're also hungry for it. It kind of shows you that they want to, just whether it's like tons of languages or one language, it feels like that's a positive thing to kind of just explore what you're slightly passionate about, what you're interested about, whatever catches your interest. Would you say, tell you what, I'm gonna challenge you with this, because I'm thinking of aspiring developers. They don't know what interests them. They don't know what to explore. How did you get that creativity? How did you come up with these ideas and identify these problems so you could create these kind of quirky solutions that, yeah.
So full disclosure, I've been programming since I was 8.
Okay.
So this was a learned habit over the years, right? And when I was a kid, it was music players. And I don't know what got me into that, but just writing music players in like 1998 was like, it was a thing. MP3 started to become a thing. So then I was writing something else, right? I probably made like 5 or 6 of them in like different languages, mostly different flavors of Visual Basic back then. But what eventually, as it became more professional, I spent a lot of time reading, basically, and that would be your number one input into what an idea was. To kind of go back to my Lua comment earlier of why I wrote a pet project, it was just a Hacker News article that I didn't totally understand. And I remember those days of reading technical articles and just being like, holy crap, this is a lot. Like, I don't understand anything that's happening here. And I just kind of took that bull by its horns, and that's what I used as my personal motivation. I think that as a foundation, it is important to have side projects that work in marketable skills, right? And by no means am I saying don't do that. But early on, you'll only need so many of those in order to land that first internship and land that first job. Then you're getting that experience professionally. It's how do you fill the empty air? I hate to say this because I can't say it to like anybody that works for me, but I really do think it's important for you to have side projects in your personal life. But how do you fill that empty air over there when you're not working professionally? And that's, the good area then to really start. Okay, I've got a good enough foundation here on this marketable skill set. I'm working in a Django shop. I've got a good foundation for Python, Django, and we're using Docker, right? Now I've checked a couple boxes. Now the Hacker News articles aren't quite as cryptic. Now I'm starting to kind of see the forest between the trees, and I'm able to spot the areas where I need to explore a little bit more. And then for me, it was just genuine interest. There are certain things that I've never been interested in. It's kind of funny as timing. Ray tracers is a good example of one. I had zero interest whatsoever. And I've been learning Rust lately because I try to keep my skills sharp even though I don't do a lot of programming. And I wrote a ray tracer finally. That was the most boring thing I've ever done. But and I'm glad I left to go for like 10 years. But it just, if you look at it and it's not exciting to you, it's not enticing to you, like don't do it. That doesn't lead to the good story, right? Why I avoided my wife for 4 or 5 months and built a Nintendo emulator is a good story. And I've got the stupidest Nintendo trivia you can imagine. But there was passion there. There was a lot of interest and drive. As soon as you don't have that, then it's going to be a lot harder to build those side projects. It's going to be a lot harder to find the ones that you want to do. But I would throw away any ideas that it has anything to do with what makes you employable. It's just making you a better engineer.
I think that's really good advice, because I think a lot of people dive into these projects like you get content creators that say, okay, here are the 3 projects you should build that employers will care about. And maybe like one is e-commerce or something like that. And then diving into that very first project, they're like, I don't care about building an e-commerce app. This is not interesting. And people kind of just like, they move away from it right away. They get bored. Maybe this isn't for me. Like, I see that so often. That's why I think your advice is so good.
That's the wrong. Yeah, I don't like that for. Well, it's boring to build e-commerce websites in general, right? Let's be real. But that focus on the business side of things that early on is just, it's not going to be interesting. And it's also not useful. As long as you understand the general concept that e-commerce sites have a checkout and you can buy stuff on it, that's fine by me. What I care more about for somebody coming fresh out of school is, do you know how to build it? Do you know how to debug it? Do you know how to solve problems? Because that's the important thing. You'll learn the rest over time. If you're a very senior level engineer, then I am going to expect you to think more about the business side of things and the business impact of what you're doing. But that's years down the road.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I actually think that's going to help a lot of people. So another thing I kind of had a question about, and people really struggle to list this correctly, but how do you represent the skills that you know on your resume? And I'm going to give you 2 examples. Maybe you dive into learning Node and the JavaScript stack in general, and you start getting way more comfortable with JavaScript, and that's what you focus on, that's what your projects represent. So you list JavaScript, you list Node, you list different technologies on your resume, and then you decide to experiment with Ruby. You try it, you don't like it, but you kind of learn the fundamentals a little bit, so you also list Ruby. And then you try something else, you dive into that, maybe you build a small project with it, you list that on your resume. I feel like sometimes those skills maybe don't represent what you know, but maybe I'm wrong. If you've experimented with something like that, just dove into it a little bit, should you put that skill on your resume?
Yes.
Okay.
Unless it was a 1 hour where you just went through like a tutorial or interactive thing online, then you didn't really do anything with it. But like assuming that you just did something, list them in order, generally in your comfort level. And going back to your honesty comment, that's like one of the first things that any recruiter is going to have you do is like reorder your skills based on the job that you're applying for. But that is one that I've noticed. I do pay attention to is you're applying for a Python job, you've got it listed fourth here. Are we going to be interesting to you? Saying that out loud, I don't know how I feel about that, but it definitely helps to list them in order. But it's not the end of the world. I've hired people that talk about Ruby and Python. I'm thinking about one individual in particular. I give him a hard time about it a lot because I don't particularly care for Ruby. He really likes Ruby. He did his interview in Ruby when he came to work with us recently, and but he's a Python engineer. It says a lot about partially, your eagerness to learn, and to some extent your level of with how you think about problem solving. But a lot of us learn this pretty quickly. Once you learn one language. This isn't universally true, but once you learn one language, the others are pretty easy to pick up, unless you're going into completely different paradigms. Learning C# isn't going to help you learn Haskell, but generally speaking, that is accurate. And so just knowing that somebody's comfortable in exploring things, and if he can speak to it, like, yeah, actually I just wrote this one little script in Ruby, it just did this thing, I kind of maintained it for a couple of months, that's fine. I would accept that.
Okay. Interesting.
And I might even hire you for a Ruby position if that was your experience, but you had other experience somewhere else. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I actually want to think about that a bit. I think that changes the advice that I might share with others. So I'm going to give you kind of I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit here with specifically representing yourself on your resume. So, and I think you kind of expressed your opinion, but I want to give you a common argument against. It's okay to really stretch the truth a bit and why the resume doesn't matter. So a lot of people feel like it is the employer's responsibility to weed out an engineer that doesn't actually know what they say they know. And if that company hires that engineer and basically their skills don't match what they say, it was the company's responsibility to test them properly. The interview process at that company is broken. So if an engineer gets in by representing themselves accurately, maybe it's the company's fault and they need to improve their interview process. That's on the hiring manager. That hiring manager potentially did a bad job. What are your thoughts about that?
I think I agree with that. Because again, my point about the being dishonest in your resume is that it should stick out to that hiring manager. I'm going to ask you questions about that because that's interesting to me and you don't have the answer. Oh, okay, I'm seeing you actually kind of fudge some details here. I hate the fact that I know that there are companies out there that do exactly what you're talking about, and that's just unfortunate. I would say those are the companies you don't want to work for anyway. So, but I would certainly put that on myself or my team if we had a common pattern of that happening. At least speaking for Numerator and how we do things, individuals are very rigorously challenged with technical interviews. We cater those interviews to the individual, literally make them up on the spot for group interviews so that we make sure that we're hitting all the different bullets. And we'll usually use the resume as that sanity check of, hey, wait, did we cover this in that conversation? No, but the resume says that they did, so let's dive into that a little bit more. So if there's that big of a mismatch, then yeah, I question the hiring practices in general at the organization.
Interesting. So if they bend the truth on their resume, and your technical screening says they are qualified, that almost feels like it's okay that they did that.
I'm saying that if you are doing your due diligence as a hiring manager, you will have vetted the parts of the resume that would be concerning, whether they were true or not. And I would be very surprised in a thorough interview process that was actually able to slip through. I've seen a lot of these over the years of like calling it out of like, they said they could do that, they did this. Or my favorite is the copy pasters in the technical challenges, and like you can bring up the Stack Overflow page like while they're describing it, you know?
Yeah.
But I mean, like if you misrepresent yourself on the resume and you make it through the technical challenges, then your resume was not rigorously used in that interview process. They did not take that into consideration.
Okay. All right. I think that'll give a lot of people a lot to think about. What happens when a candidate has gone too far and they're caught? Like what happens in that interview? Do you immediately say, I'm definitely not going to hire this person, or do you try to give them a chance to tell the truth, or like what's your thought process?
9 out of 10 times they're already probably not doing well in the interview.
Okay.
I'm not of the school of thought where I'll cut an interview off midway. That's, it's an opinion. I prefer to go for a good candidate experience if things aren't going well. But generally speaking, I can't even think of a case. I can think of a lot of cases where I knew very quickly, but I can't think of a single case where I felt differently on that point. Yeah.
Okay.
Like I said, it usually just sticks out. Like I'm thinking of some recent conversations, and it was just like deer in the headlights response to my question. And I sort of realized like, okay, like that's what's happening here. But somebody that's out unprepared for their interview, like it wasn't going well in the first part. So, yeah.
Okay. It's good advice. Okay, so I'm going to choose to cut this out if you want it cut out. But I'm going to ask because you brought it up earlier before. You had mentioned that you had to fire someone that lied on their resume.
Yep.
So they got through the process, but you still ended up firing them. What was that situation?
We did not have good hiring practices at that company. That is a perfect example of what I'm referring to. We actually revamped that hiring practices at that company about a year later. That person it was a startup. We were hacky. I blame the process, not the individual in that particular case. But they did make it through. It did become very clear within about 3 weeks that this was highly misrepresented. And that was that.
Okay, interesting. I like hearing about your experiences. This definitely sheds a light on a lot of questions that I've even gone over in my mind over and over and over. So I love your advice so far. Now we're going to do some more closed-ended questions, maybe closed-ended, maybe open, but I'm really curious about these. So should you have different resumes for different positions? For example, if you're applying to front-end positions versus back-end, are those going to look differently?
Yeah, probably. I would just hope that you're comfortable with that. I mentioned it before that my resume has changed over the years. And I believe there was a point in time, I don't recall specifically, but I believe there's a point in time that I was floating both around, both for leadership roles and for IC roles. Back end, front end, using that example, I would just say some of the other things we've been talking about tonight, like as long as you can speak to those things, as long as you have good experience that you can have a discussion about, I think it's fine. If you lack that, or if just one of them alone isn't really enough to be enticing, I would just put them together. Doesn't really matter. Until you look like a full stack developer, you look better.
Okay, interesting. So should you include your address on your resume if you're applying for out-of-state positions? Or should that come up in the interview, potentially, if they do ask? Because a lot of... Yeah, I'll let you...
Weird question in post-COVID, right? Like,
Right.
it's not post-COVID, like we're definitely still in it. In 2/3 of the way through COVID.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know. It's a weird market right now. I guess if I'd be courteous to the employer if it's not clearly listed as remote, maybe be conscientious of that. If you live in Indiana, just over the border, and you're applying to a Chicago job, like, it doesn't matter, right? But if you were trying to get a remote position, I would apply for a remote position. Just seems that these days most positions are remote. So
yeah, that's true. And this is kind of a weird time to even ask this question, because this question would probably look differently before COVID.
a year ago.
Yeah. Okay, so I think a lot of the concern is, when I was applying for positions out of state, a lot of employers did not reach back. I got most of my callbacks from Chicago, specifically being in Northwest Indiana. And so, I always wondered, why aren't I getting a callback? Because I'm willing to pay for my travel expenses. I will move. I will pay for everything. I just want a job. And that's the mindset of a lot of people. Like, they're so desperate for a job, like, they'll pay for that move. They'll pay for any moving expenses whatsoever. They'll relocate for the company. But a lot of people feel like employers aren't calling them back out of state. So that's why they don't list their address. Do you feel like there are any hesitations employers have that can't be resolved with some of that stuff that, are there any hesitations about hiring out of state?
I personally don't care, but I can definitely imagine scenarios where top of funnel, you're getting dropped for that. I don't know what the impact would necessarily be if you didn't put it on. But again, like, maybe that's changing now. Now got me kind of wondering. I'm going to take a look at the next couple that I get. There would be, if I'm putting on my HR hat, there would be a gut reaction of, oh, this person's totally out of state, not even like nearby Indiana. You're like in Florida or something. And I know what our relocation policies are, and that's not part of this role. That would definitely be grounds to quickly just remove the resume. So I would have the conversation with the person. I've done it many times, but I think that's a bit harder to say that there's any blanket right or wrong on it.
Okay, interesting. I think a lot of people want to know that. Last question. Do you read cover letters? If
No.
so, let's start with that. Do you read cover letters? Do they matter?
No, I don't.
Oh.
I can't speak to the HR aspect of them, but I've like read one or two. I don't mean this like disingenuously. Like, I've written them myself too, and I know sometimes you have to fill it out. It's like automated application systems that you use. Like, they expect something to be there. They all read the same way, and half of us are getting from a template online, anyways. Right. So no, I don't actually read them. I don't know of any HR personnel that read them, but it's still a thing with some companies. I rarely they even get passed on to me these days. But I will also say I've never worked in a company that required them. So it's rare that one actually pops up.
Okay. So if they're relevant, if they matter, it's more of an HR thing. Doesn't even get to
That's my guess, because I know that I don't care, and I've never met an engineering manager that cares about them. Like, the resume speaks, and this may be just more of software engineering as opposed to other roles. I can certainly imagine other roles where maybe that does become more important, and maybe that type of manager would care about that. But like, going back to my pattern matching comment from earlier, in a software role, first thing I'm looking for is, do you have the skills or any of this clear signals that this is going to be a good conversation? That's what I'm skimming for. I want to make sure you're not jumping to jobs like every 20 minutes. I want to make sure that you got some good experience under your belt and you can tell a good story. And I want to make sure that you look like a creative problem solver. None of that has to do with your cover letter, because anybody can put on their cover letter. I don't jump around. I like to learn things, and I'm creative.
Yeah.
I want to see the proof of that.
I like that you laid out all three. I think that says a lot. And I know a lot of you that do watch my videos, there's advice from Scott that definitely suggests different things than I've suggested. And I feel like I've learned a lot from this conversation. I brought you on because you're honest. Like, I didn't really look at your views beforehand. I brought you on because you're honest. And this, I think, is going to be a really valuable video. Okay, cool. So we're going to wrap up with this question, and we'll ask where people can reach you. So with this question, if you had to give like one final piece of advice for aspiring developers that wanted to get a position, what would it be? Never
stop writing. You got to have your side projects. That is the single most important thing. You can go dry for extended period. I don't know what the market looks like right now for entry-level engineers, so I can't really, speak to immediate experience there. I'm definitely outdated, but eventually you get enough under your belt, you are going to be very good at what you do, and it's going to be very easy to talk your way through that technical interview in a very honest, genuine fashion.
I love it. Great advice. All right, Scott, if people wanted to reach out to you, where could they reach you?
Scott.Ferguson@Numerator.com. We are hiring. We also have internships year-round, so feel free to reach out.
That's awesome. That's not a very common thing that you see. So if you are looking for an internship, definitely consider Numerator. But Scott, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's fun.
There's the awkward pause. All right, cool.
Is that what that was?
That's what that was.
Supposed to say something else?